Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson, and I am here today with Ira Chaleff, and it is so great to have this opportunity to learn with you. We were just chatting before about how this is a rescheduled webinar. We were going to do it earlier, and there was a big blizzard on the East Coast, if all of you remember. We're back today finally for this amazing chance to learn. Ira, welcome.
Thanks, Becky. Great to be here.
So as we begin, I want to let you know about a few key items. I'm often asked, will we share the slides? Yes, we will. So after this event, I'll be sending some follow-up to you via email, and it will include a PDF of today's slides to help you with your learning. The second thing is people often ask, oh, I had to leave early. Will there be a recording? And the answer is yes, we always record our webinars, and this session, like every other session, will be recorded and available forever on our website. So you'll have the opportunity to share it with someone perhaps where you work or to watch it again for yourself. I'd also like to invite you today to interact with us in a couple of different ways. The first is to live tweet during this session if you like to tweet, as I do. And we're using the hashtag today, Intelligent Disobedience. That's a mouthful and a long hashtag, but we hope that you'll add it to your tweets so that we can see the conversation from you. The second way we're going to ask you to interact with us today is through the question panel, and we are going to stop a couple of times during the event so that we can hear your input. And so I want to ask you right now, if you wouldn't mind, to try out that question panel and let us know where you're calling from and what you're looking forward to about today's events. And that way we can see that you know how to use it. And later in the event, when we have time for Q&A, we'll be able to see that. Oh my goodness. So we have folks already from across the country, several from Ohio. It looks like someone here from Italy. We've got North Carolina and Canada and New Jersey and California and Mexico and Kansas and Utah and Arizona. Welcome. Yvonne says she's looking forward to learning more about the best way to disobey. And Mary says she is really eager to hear you speak. Wow. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for letting us know that you're here. And we always like to chat a little bit at the beginning so that we have a chance to make sure everyone's on when the meat of the presentation begins. So awesome. So we have someone on the line from Australia, and I'm wondering, is it the middle of the night in Australia, Bob? We also have someone on the line from India. So this is truly an international audience, and we're so glad to have you attending and learning with us. It's 3:30 in the morning. Bob, that is some serious commitment. Thank you. I want to take a quick moment to let you know about Ira and more about who he is. As you can probably guess by the topic of the webinar, Ira is the author of Intelligent Disobedience. You might not know that he has also written two other books, The Courageous Follower, and he was a co-editor on a book called The Art of Followership, which is part of the Warren Bennis Leadership Series. So Ira lives in the Washington, D.C. area, and he serves as an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University. He's the president of Executive Coaching and Consulting Associations, and he's also the chairman emeritus of a nonpartisan Congressional Management Foundation. Ira, it is so wonderful to have you here with us today, and I look forward to interacting with you more throughout the event.
Thanks very much, Becky. So it's over to me now?
It is over to you. I'm going to
All
shut
right.
off my camera, and it's all
All right.
yours.
Well, welcome, everyone. I'm actually talking to you from the beautiful foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., where I live. As Becky said, we're going to be talking about the theme of my book, Intelligent Disobedience, doing right when what you're told to do is wrong. For the purposes of today's webinar, I've given it an also known as Intelligent Disobedience, the CEO's best friend. Why do I say the CEO's best friend? Do CEOs value disobedience, even intelligent disobedience? Well, let's take a look at what this is all about. So first of all, let me tell you how I came to this topic of intelligent disobedience. I do a lot of workshops around my book, The Courageous Follower. And the subtitle of that book is Standing Up to and for Our Leaders. And we talk about authority and how most of the time it makes sense to comply with what you're asked to do, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it can even be dangerous. A woman in one of my workshops raised her hand and said, I have an example of this under the table. Well, that got my attention. What did she mean under the table? She had a dog under the table, and she explained that this dog was being trained to be a guide dog for a person who was blind. And for the first 18 months of the dog's life, it lived with her family to socialize it and to teach it all of the commands that it would need to know to be a guide dog and how to obey them. She said then the dog would be sent to a higher level trainer to teach it intelligent disobedience. First time I ever heard that term. So I asked her, what is that? And she explained that occasionally the person who the dog is supporting will give an order that, if obeyed, would produce harm for the person and the dog, in other words, for the team. And therefore, it had to be able to discern between what orders to obey and what orders not to obey. And even if the order was repeated, it had to know how to resist that order. Well, that really got my attention. And of course, you can imagine the wheels turning in my head when I thought, if we can teach dogs the difference, what about human beings? What are we even doing to try to do that? And that began my journey. So intelligent disobedience, in its essence, is saying no when what you're told to do will have a harmful result. It builds on that because just saying no isn't enough. The dog and the human have to often come up with better solutions to achieve the desired and legitimate goal. And we'll talk about that. But first we have a question here. Why do people give orders that would have a harmful outcome? It's not just that there are ethical issues. So there certainly can be ethical issues, and we will talk about that. But think about it for a moment. Leaders are under a great deal of pressure from all quarters, stakeholders, investors, unions, regulators, competitors, boards, and they get tired, they get stressed. They don't have all the information they need to always give a correct order, and yet they feel the need to act. So they issue orders. Well, the question then becomes, if we understand why a leader can sometimes issue an order they shouldn't, what happens at the follower end? The question is, if the order is wrong, if the order is going to have a harmful result, why do followers obey? Well, we have seen too many headlines where people obey orders, programs, policies that have a harmful result, and sometimes a tragic result. VW is a major recent example. We know that what was called defeat devices were installed in the automobiles so that when they went for their emissions test, they passed with flying colors. Whereas when they were back on the road, many of these vehicles were issuing or emitting 40 times the amount of toxic emissions than they were allowed to. Well, what happened here? Somebody, if high up, issued an order to do this. We don't know why. It seems incredible that they would have. But somebody did, and somebody followed the order. Not a senior executive who implemented the programming in the car that effected this result. Why did those people, trained professionals, competent engineers, responsible in many areas of their life, why would they follow a wrong order? Well, let's examine some of the factors that contribute to this. We have this concept of hierarchy. And in hierarchy, we have structure. We have different levels of authority. And in hierarchies, people have roles that are assigned to them externally. And these roles clarify who sets policy, who can issue orders, who can approve budget. And if these structures are well-known, well thought out, they enhance the group's efficiency. So there's nothing inherently wrong with authority structures. In fact, they facilitate coordinated organizational action. In contrast to that concept of externally assigned roles, we have the concept of authority relationships. And I draw on this from a book called Don't Kill the Bosses, Escaping the Hierarchy Trap by Colbert and Ullman. They observed that authority relationships are internalized rules of behavior towards authority. In other words, these are rules that are not written down. They're rules that emerge from the culture, from our family of origin, from other forms of indoctrination. And they tell us when we should and shouldn't speak up to those who are above us or below us. And this inhibits the flow of important information, ideas, candor, and it reduces the personal sense of accountability and impede innovation. So these are very problematic. And we have to examine what do we do about this, about these tendency for professionals to act out from these authority relationships, these rule sets of behavior. Well, what are some examples of these rule sets? Well, they may be, I shouldn't speak until I'm asked to. I should never correct someone publicly. When I speak, I should be very deferential, even though I may get dismissed if I'm too deferential, rather than being clear about what needs to be said. If my idea is rejected, I shouldn't try again. Or I should just accept that the authority probably knows better than I know. Now, if you think about these rules, and you've seen all of them play out at some point at different times in organizations, where do they come from? Well, they're not very different than the rules used to socialize our children in schools, towards their teachers, towards their religious teachers, towards their scoutmasters, towards their coaches. Well, we need to grow out of that early conditioning. And as professionals, we must be able to overcome these rules. Well, you say, easy for you to say, Ira, but I might get fired if I say no to an order. And yes, you might. But let me use the example of this woman we're looking at here, Betty Vincent, from WorldCom as a cautionary tale. Some of you, or many of you, may remember that WorldCom was a major telecommunications firm, second largest in the U.S. at one point, a high flyer, the darling of Wall Street, and they seemed to be no end to their growth. Well, as it turned out, they were actually having some problems that they wanted to hide. So orders came down to Betty Vincent, who is in the accounting department, to just this 1 month, could she massage the numbers a bit so that they did not show the losses that had actually been incurred. Well, Betty Vincent was a professional. She knew that wasn't right. She actually went home and wrote out a letter of resignation. And then she tore it up because she didn't want to lose her job. And she complied with his very ill-advised order. And the order was repeated month after month until finally Betty was responsible for hiding billions of dollars of losses. And one day the internal auditor came in and confronted her with it, and she broke down and admitted what she had done. She felt guilty, she felt sorry, she felt remorseful, but that didn't keep her from getting a jail sentence. And the judge at the trial said had she refused to do it, that the conspiracy might be nipped in the bud. Well, whether or not it would have been, at least Betty Vincent wouldn't have gone to jail and had such great disruption of personal and family life. And that's an example of how sometimes playing it safe, being afraid to do the right thing, actually has much worse consequences. Let's take another example here that's never made any headlines, but I think is a very powerful example of the kinds of situations we might find ourselves in, and the need for us to have thought about how would we respond in those situations. Again, I was teaching a workshop on courageous followership. This time it was to doctoral students. During a break, one of the students came up to me and explained that when she was a young nurse, some 20 years earlier, she was fresh out of nursing school, and she had been assigned to the emergency room, and a cardiac patient was wheeled in, and the physician did a cursory examination and ordered her to administer a certain drug. Well, this was a drug she had been taught was contraindicated in that situation. Now, just for a moment, get the dynamics here. Physician with all the stature of the physician, young nurse, fresh out of nursing school, probably gender power dynamics at that time as well. Yet, should she obey this order to administer a drug that she had been taught could actually harm the patient, maybe even kill them? So she tried to raise this with the doctor and explain that her training said that wasn't the right drug. Well, he was stressed, he was busy, and he said, you just do what I said. Put yourself in that situation. If she obeyed and it was the wrong drug, she might have the death of this patient on her conscience. If she didn't obey and he was right, she might have the death of this patient on her conscience. Let me ask you for a moment, what would you do in a stress situation like that, in her situation, when she needed to take an action quickly, but did not want to obey a wrong order? Take a moment and let's see some of the answers, Becky, that you get from the folks listening.
Sure, and I'm back on the line with you, Ira, and would welcome people's responses of what you would do in this situation. I'll be sharing those in just a minute. Oh, those are coming in so fast. So Amy says she'd go to another doctor or someone higher up to present the situation. Hector says he would defer the burden of the decision to the doctor. Amanda said she would ask why this was the appropriate drug. Janelle says get a second opinion, seek feedback from a supervisor or more experienced nurse. A lot of people saying get a second opinion, go to a supervisor. Need the why, which would turn the instruction into value. Go to supervisor, head nurse, follow my conscience, escalate the issue, re-raise the issue with the doctor, err on the side of life, go to a manager. Here's a longer situation. Someone said they found themselves in a similar situation as an attorney and was asked to do something by a senior partner that could have jeopardized her law license, and decided not to obey the direction because she'd rather have the license than do something unethical. So lots of second opinion comments here. So thanks to all of you for sharing those.
Right, and those are all good answers. And in fact, in nursing school these days, that is what's taught. But that wasn't what was taught back then. The nurse was pretty much on her own and subject to the orders of the physician. Well, here's what this nurse did. She hooked up the IV bag with the prescription, with a drug that the doctor ordered. And she called the doctor over and she said, it's ready to go, but my training tells me this isn't right, so I can't turn the valve. If you are confident that this is the right medication, you will need to turn the valve. And that was enough to get him to rethink, prescribe a different, safer medication. And the story had a positive ending. But just think the presence that this nurse had to have in such a stress situation. So rather than leave people to have to think on their feet, the whole point of my work in Intelligent Disobedience is to examine what do we need to do to prepare people better. So here are some of the elements of Intelligent Disobedience. First, you are responsible. It does not matter who issued the order. You're responsible if you obey it. You have to observe the risk. You can't outsource observing the risk. If you feel the order is wrong, you need to slow down the action, resist the immediate pressure to obey, and then do something that we can borrow from guide dog training, which is called a counterpull. Just imagine for a moment if a blind person is on a train platform and they think the train is in front of them, and they give the dog the command to go forward. But the dog sees that going forward would have very bad consequences. Instead of not just obeying, the dog actually does what they call a counterpull, where it pulls the person in the other direction, and then it finds safer alternatives, it executes those alternatives, and it returns the lead to the individual, the person. So that, in a sense, is a bit of a roadmap of what we're trying to equip people to do. Of course, with human beings, we don't just have counterpole. We have our voice. Interestingly enough, dogs are taught not to bark as a warning because barking can be confusing. It can scare people around them. But humans we must use our voice if voice is available to us. So the question becomes, how do we say no? There are different ways that are effective, more effective, and less effective. We're all familiar with this concept of assertive language. Assertive language is assured, it's firm, it's not aggressive. Simple example. That's something I can't agree to. Linguists tell us that there's another language which most of us are not aware of. It's called mitigating language. Mitigating means to make less serious, to dilute, to soften, to hedge. So in this case, the example would be, well, instead of saying that's something I can't agree to, it'd be, well, maybe that's something we shouldn't be doing before we examine it a little more. And you see that has a very different quality. Now, mitigating language has its uses in places where power is very unevenly distributed in cultures that would take great offense at direct assertive language. But mitigating language used in the wrong situation can be very dangerous because it does not get the leader's attention sufficiently to get them to change course. We have a very real-world example of this with a lot of case history from the aviation industry. In the 1970s, there was a rash of fatal airline crashes, and the analysis of what was causing these crashes came down to human error. And the main human error was either that the individual who saw something wrong but thought, well, if I see it, others must see it, so they didn't say anything, or they tried to say something to the captain, but they said it in too softly, not assertively enough, and the captain blew them off. And when you read the black box transcripts of this, it's very painful. You can see the co-pilot or another crew member using weak language to try to get the captain's attention. And a minute and 20 seconds later, everyone aboard dies. So this is a very serious issue where safety is concerned. And the airline industry developed a training program called Crew Resource Management, in which all flight crews are put into simulators where they experience things that go wrong. And everybody is required to speak up if they see something wrong and to speak up assertively enough to get command's attention. By simply instituting this protocol, this training, the flight safety record of the airline industry improved dramatically and has stayed so to this day. So we have a very real-world example of how a little bit of training, this is maybe this crew resource management flight simulation, changes the whole safety outlook. But why do we need to train people to do this? Isn't it common sense? Wouldn't we, of course, speak up or refuse to obey if there was a dangerous order? We all would like to think so. But in the 1960s, many of you are aware of some of this information, Stanley Milgram at Yale did a series of experiments on obedience in which the subject thought that they were part of the experiment and that to determine could you improve learning, the speed of learning by administering electric shocks. So they didn't know they were the actual subject. And they had in front of them what they thought was a shock generator. And every time they asked a question and the learner gave a wrong answer, they were required to give the person a shock. And each time it had to be 15 volts higher, all the way to 450 volts. Well, that sounds crazy. Who would do that? Before Milgram started the experiment, he surveyed people to see did they think they would obey in that situation. Here's the results. He surveyed three groups. He put them in a room. He had psychiatrists, only 39 psychiatrists, students, 31, and a general cross-section of middle-class folks, about 40 of them. As you can see, virtually everyone thought they would stop by 240 volts. Half the people thought they'd stop at 120 volts when the person started to show signs of discomfort. By 240, virtually everyone thought they'd stop, and no one thought they'd go to 450 volts. Well, those of you familiar with the experiment will know that's not how it played out. In fact, two-thirds of the people, the subjects, obeyed to 450 volts. And this was not an anomaly. This experiment was repeated many times in different places with virtually the same results. So we have a very problematic question here. Why do people obey when they shouldn't? In this situation, no one was holding a gun to their head, and no one could fire them where they'd lose their job. What was causing them to obey was simply the fact that an authority figure with a lab coat and a clipboard was telling them that the experiment required them to continue. And that's very worrisome. And what we observed in those experiments was something that I want you to really think about, because I think this is critical. Milgram observed that there are two states that we act in. One is the autonomous state. In the autonomous state, we make choices based on our own understanding of what's right, what's wrong, and we take responsibility for those choices. In contrast to that, he observed that there's what he called an agentic state, and that's where we act as an agent on behalf of an authority figure, and then we don't feel responsible for those choices. Obviously, this is an extremely dangerous state of affairs, and it is why maniacal leaders can get whole populations to do terrible things, and they don't feel responsible. They feel that they were just following orders. Okay, we learned after the World War II through the Nuremberg trials that it is not a legal defense to say I was just following orders. If you had possibility of a moral choice, you were held accountable. So this is a lesson that we need to take with us through a whole variety of situations in life. It's too easy to feel that someone else is accountable. Here's what happens. We can say, okay, I'm going to be accountable. But pay attention to what Milgram observed as to the sequence that can lead to accountability or non-accountability. First is, in this experiment, people cooperated. They thought they were doing a valid experiment with a socially positive mission to determine could we accelerate learning. Once they started to see the strain that the learner was under, they were saying, oh, this hurts. Oh, I didn't know this was going to, be so painful. They started to use mitigating language mainly to express, should we be going on? They would, express some discomfort, and the authority figure would just say, the experiment requires we continue. Please continue. At some point, the subject was experiencing and expressing such distress. All of this was an actor, by the way. They weren't really getting these electric shocks. But they would be banging on the wall saying, let me out, I refuse to go on, I have a heart condition, and eventually they would even stop responding at all. At this point, the subjects would say, this is really a problem. Are you sure we should go on? They were experiencing tremendous psychological strain. Should I obey the authority? Should I obey my own sense of what's happening here? To resolve that strain, they had to make one of two choices. The first choice was to obey. If they obeyed and said, well, the authority knows best, that actually resolved the strain for them. On the other hand, they could refuse to obey. They could amplify their own divergence from the authorities' perceptions, and by refusing to obey, they would now had taken a clear stand, which also eliminated the strain. So here's the point. Eliminating the strain by itself is not the goal. We have to take the choice which reduces continuing to do something harmful. And it takes some preparation to be able to do this for most people. A few people, as we saw in the experiment, naturally refused to obey, but most were not equipped to do that. And afterwards they would say, well, I told him I thought it was wrong. That doesn't absolve you. It isn't enough for us to say, well, I thought it was wrong. I told him it was wrong. It's what we do that counts. Now, these are obviously standards which are not so easy to create within an organization. It takes some work. How do we develop this intelligent disobedience? Interestingly enough, Milgram didn't explore that. He did some very important work on how we could reorder the social construct to reduce the obedience. In my book, I spent quite a bit of time examining this because it's important information. But he didn't look at what you and I might look at. Many of you on this phone call are trainers, you're consultants, you're coaches, and we know that we can develop skills in people as part of their professional development. That's not something that Milgram paid attention to. And it's what my work on intelligent disobedience is doing now to build a bridge from this terrible tendency, human tendency, when we shouldn't, to to equip people to do the right thing even when they're given a wrong order. Where do we draw from? We can draw from guide dog training itself. I examine in the book a number of the techniques that are used that are actually transferable to human development. We can look to the aviation industry. They really have very well-developed protocol for how to build this into the expectation personnel. Most recently, hospitals have paid a lot of attention to how to do this. People have read that there were far too many deaths caused by errors in hospitals. Hospital industry actually turned to the aviation industry to see how could they change this. They had a very similar problem in surgeries where the surgeon was next to God, and the nurses, etc., didn't speak up assertively when they should have. Well, now the protocol in virtually all hospital surgeries is that everyone in that room must verbally assent to beginning the operation and to completing it. And if the lowest person in that room says, I counted that we put 14 sponges in, we've only taken 13 out, we need to keep looking before we complete the surgery, the surgeon must also look further. So we have found that there are ways to reduce the impact of authority on our willingness, our preparedness to speak up when we should speak up to do the right thing. We even have examples in from child safety. Many of us remember when, who knows, in kindergarten or whatever, if our clothes catch on fire, what were we supposed to do? Stop, drop, and roll. And 30, 40 years later, you ask somebody, what should you do when your clothes catch on fire? Stop, drop, and roll. Well, it shows us that even a small amount of practice prepares people to do the right thing. Sometimes saying no seems just too difficult. I have clients who report to three-star generals or political appointees where they're too imposing figures. Well, we can also teach people to use the techniques from improv theater where they never say no. They say yes and. Yes, sir, we need to take care of that. And here's a way to do so. And they find better ways. In a sense, it's a gentle counterpole to getting the positional leader to do the right thing. We also have a situation where we will not always be the first person to speak up. There may be someone else in the group, some brave soul, who actually speaks up first and says, this isn't right. We need to do this differently. Often they would become the target of the authority figure unless other people in the room, the second and third voices, speak up and say, yes, we do. We see that problem as well. We need to stop and address that problem. This is very well documented, interestingly enough, in the literature on bullying prevention. The bully could be considered a leader giving an unethical order. And if the first person who speaks up against the bully is supported by the second and third person, the bullying almost always stops completely. These are all transferable lessons to various areas of our workplace and our home lives. But it needs to be, it doesn't just happen. Um, the military, for example, there's tremendous conditioning to say, yes, sir, salute and execute, salute and execute. Well, a lieutenant came up to me during a break in one of my presentations, and he told me a story about a captain who knew that there was great risks if their people just saluted and executed without taking accountability for the order. So the captain gave the lieutenant an order. The lieutenant saluted and turned to leave, and the captain said, hold on, did what I just tell you make sense? And the lieutenant, of course, smartly said, yes, sir. And the captain said, are you sure it made sense? And the lieutenant said, well, sir, no, it didn't fully make sense because of such and such. And the captain said, I need to know that before you leave here, you let me know if an order of mine doesn't make sense. And the lieutenant said, yes, sir. And the captain said, that's not good enough. We need to practice this. And the captain said, I'm going to give you an order, and you're going to tell me, sir, that's BS. What? The lieutenant couldn't believe what he was hearing. He could hardly bring those words out of his mouth. But the captain made him practice that until he could say it. As smartly as he could say, yes, sir, he could say, sir, that's BS. Well, a few weeks later, he told me that he came to the report to the captain, and the captain's colonel was in the office, and the colonel's nephew was on the base, and he had misappropriated a military vehicle, and he was trying to make this issue disappear. And the lieutenant told the captain told the lieutenant what the situation was, and the lieutenant, as he was trained, said, "Sir, that's BS, sir." Well, you can imagine the reaction of the colonel. You know, what did he just say to you? Well, the captain said, "Sir, it's okay. I'll take care of it." He put his arm around the lieutenant, sort of walked him out of the room, and said, "You did a good job, but get out of here before he kills you." Well, that's, again, perhaps an extreme story, but it tells us what we really sometimes need to do in order to create a culture of candor. And that's what we're looking for here. Not only in adults, but in our children as well. We all know that most authority figures have our children's best interests at heart, do everything they can to keep them safe and take care of them. But unfortunately, we also know that there are exceptions to that rule. And we need to prepare our children to take a stand if they get a wrong order or a dangerous order. We've developed a new way of doing this. It's kind of like stop, drop, and roll. It's called blink, think, choice, and voice. And what we're basically doing is saying, if the coach tells you to do something that doesn't seem right, instead of just kind of being startled, blink a few times to kind of regain control of your startle reaction. Think, does that seem right? That's not what I've been taught to do. Make a choice. You can either obey or you can do something differently. seek out a parent, seek out someone else to help you think it through. Or or if nobody else is around, you might have to just go to voice and say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not right. These simple methods can keep our children safe as well and prepare them for adulthood when they will have professional situations where intelligent disobedience is required. So that gives you a sense of the scope of this issue. Becky, if there are a few questions, I'd like to try to respond to them now.
Yes, absolutely. There are several questions that are coming in, and I will share them with you. Um, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get to many of these. So Karen says, Ira, that she's interested in using courageous followership and intelligent disobedience to empower people in groups and cultures that are used to a large power difference and wouldn't be inclined to challenge leadership even when it's unethical because of generations of learning or threats of violence. So do you have any suggestions on how to effectively do this?
Well, what I have found is that you have to adapt this to the culture. A dramatic story was when I was in India. And India is a very, stratified, high power difference culture. Caste system is operative. And I was trying to teach courageous followership. And one of the people in my group said, well, here's what he had to do in order to overcome his fear of or reluctance to speak and correct his superior. He said that when his superior asked him a question about something, and he thought it was a wrong direction to be going in. Instead of initially saying something, he would kind of look in great thought, and he would take his pen, and he would clearly be thinking until the his superior said, come, you tell me what you're thinking," which now was such a direct order that he felt empowered to obey. And he said one day his superior gave him an order, and he reached into his pocket for his pen, and he didn't have it. And he was so nervous, he didn't know what to do with his hands. And his superior actually saw what was happening and handed him his pen. So they had figured out a culturally appropriate kind of ritual on how to do this. So I think that people on the ground are going to have to work this through, but we all understand that in any culture this is a necessary skill.
That's very helpful. And Ira, I have to tell you, I was sitting here laughing out loud when you shared that story about the Army situation. My brother is a general in the U.S. Army, and I'm going to have him listen to this recording because that was a priceless story.
Yeah.
So Lucille has this question that I think is really interesting, and she's asking how we encourage people to pull away from things being right or wrong instead of things being beneficial or not beneficial. Curious if you have a point of view about that.
Well, I do very much. I like that language a lot. In fact, my own sense of my work in the world is I describe it as helping leaders use power beneficially. That is actually, I think it's important to use power beneficially, and to correct or disempower leaders who use power harmfully. I simply use the word right and wrong because, frankly, um, beneficial doesn't flow off the tongue as well in the English language. If I said intelligent disobedience, doing things beneficially when you're told to do things unbeneficially, it doesn't fly. But she's absolutely right. That is the correct sense.
Sure. So here's another question for you. Someone is wondering if there are similarities between intelligent disobedience and civil disobedience.
Yes, it's an important question. I make a clear distinction in the book about the two because many people are familiar with civil disobedience and few are with intelligent disobedience. Civil disobedience is where we knowingly break a law or a regulation, and we do so publicly in order to bring attention to the injustice in the law and with the intention of changing it. And we're willing to accept the consequences which very often means being arrested and put in jail for taking this stand. It's a very courageous stance, of course. Few of us will be called to take that level of disobedience in our lives. Intelligent disobedience is acting within the system. The system may be imperfect. It probably is imperfect. But nevertheless, it works reasonably well. But the order that we're giving is not a beneficial order. It would produce harm. So we are taking a stand within that system. We're not breaking a law. We're not calling in, the media. We're taking a stand so that we prevent a wrong action from being done that would be harmful. Now, it may be that there's a bridge from intelligent disobedience in some cases to civil disobedience, but that's not the main focus of this work.
Thanks so much. So we have another comment here related to bullying, and someone is sharing that she unsubscribed from a forum because she was bullied and no one stood up. And the person who caused the trouble wasn't banned from the list. So this listener is wondering, how can we build people up to speak their minds publicly when they don't agree with how someone has been treated?
It's very tough. The online world is very tough. In this beautiful rural county in which I live in, has a communal listserv, and the bad behavior on it is disgraceful. And every time several people speak up trying to tamp down the bad behavior, the behavior just gets more virulent. It's a real issue. I don't have great answers for it because it's that trade-off between having a moderated discussion in which sometimes important ideas can be censored out and having a fully free discussion, which is sometimes very offensive. And we're seeing this actually play out on college campuses, aren't we? This, this exact issue. And as a society, we're going to have to evolve our own answers to that. And I think in each group within our society will have to evolve its answers.
Thanks, Ira. So I have a question here from Michael Eric Siegel, who's from the Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C., and indicating that for me to share with the group. He's wondering, Ira, if we don't also need to teach authority figures to appreciate intelligent disobedience. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And Michael, I'm glad that Michael's on the line. Michael first invited me in to teach courageous followership 15 years ago or so in the judicial system, federal judicial system, and he is doing a great job doing it himself since then. Yes, absolutely. And, in the first edition of the book, The Courageous Follower, I only addressed the follower role. In the second edition, I addressed the leader role because there were too many instances where courageous followers tried to bring problems to the attention of senior leaders and were not given the attention the matters deserve with grave consequences. So I included a chapter, and in my workshops I include a segment in which we talk about how can leaders create the environment which encourages candor. Now, I have to be cautioned, though, that we often will not be able to reach the leaders in a formal way and train them in this. If we can, terrific, or if they're naturally good at it, terrific. We can't give away too much power to the formal leaders. In other words, it's precisely when they're not good at this that we need to really have developed our own skills, our own language, our own courage muscle. And the preparation we do in the workshops I teach, and hopefully I give a lot of languaging in both books on how to do this better. Hopefully it becomes a meme within the culture so that both people in the follower role and the leader role take this seriously. And by the way, I just should note that follower is a role, And most of us, most of the people on this call and most of the people in the organizations we coach and train play both the leader and follower role. So we really do need to teach this as it applies to both roles.
Sure, that's very helpful. Thanks, Ira. So Roy is wondering how you can apply intelligent disobedience when a company's culture will not support it. So should we be willing to put our jobs on the line?
Well, again, I think, the example I gave with Betty Vincent and WorldCom is a cautionary example. We do sometimes need to put our jobs on the line. It's rare. I don't want to, inflate this. Most of the time, if we're good at our jobs and we're respected in our jobs, and we say to a senior leader, I can't do that because that actually would put our reputation at stake. Most of the time, you're going to be listened to, but occasionally you won't be. And therefore, just as someone else said about the law office she worked in, are you going to put your job on the line, or are you going to put your professional license on the line? I think you're better putting your job on the line than your professional license on the line. So these are very personal decisions. They have to be made in context. Again, in Intelligent Disobedience and in The Courageous Follower, I examine different ways to think about when and how should you choose to use intelligent disobedience and to speak up as a courageous follower.
Sure. Well, before I ask another question, I do have an interesting comment here that I thought was really helpful that came from Mary. She said that when she's asked a supervisor a question about an instruction that didn't make sense, she would start by prefacing it to say, know that I'm asking this because I want to do a good job. So that's a helpful idea that Mary is sharing that I thought I would share.
Thank you, Mary.
So Jack is wondering what actual exercises you can recommend that will help people learn how to intelligently disobey.
Yes. Well, interestingly, we're putting up a little video today for parents on how to help children do this. And in the last slide, I'll give you a link to that. And we have some role play language that parents can use with children. Within your industries, I think you need to be creative and create some scenarios. In the world of moral character development, what is observed is that most of the time people do know the right thing. They don't know how to do the right thing. And we need to give them a little bit of practice scenarios. So you can, again, taking it from guide dog training, start with simple scenarios, have them practice using their voice in a situation, and then build on the complexity of those scenarios. And obviously, they're going to be extremely different if it's a situation, in a school, in a nuclear facility, in a insurance agency. You have to create culturally, contextually relevant scenarios, and then just take a little time to play them out, switch roles, be the leader, be the follower. And even just a very little bit of this prepares one so that when that moment happens, when we're called upon to do something that's we really shouldn't do, we don't have that startled deer in the headlight look. Instead, we have kind of a script that prepares us for how to intelligently disobey and effectively disobey.
Sure. So yeah, this is a very interesting question that came in from Lorraine. She's wondering what happens in a situation where you've used intelligent disobedience correctly and spoken up, and then there's an outcome still that's negative. How would you recommend that someone move forward after that?
Well, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but let me say this: that I would need to know more to really answer that. But let me say this: that because intelligent disobedience and the courageous follower model are closely related, in the courageous follower model, one of the options is the courage to leave. If you feel that your voice is not effective and that you're not comfortable with the decisions that are made, if you feel that, safety, life, the law is, too much risks are being taken, well, you may need to leave that situation. If it's truly egregious, then you may have to consider, do you go outside the organization and become a whistleblower? As we all know, whistleblowers pay a terrible price. So everything within my work on the Courageous Follower and Intelligent Disobedience is to try to equip people, and both from the leader and follower role and the organizational culture, to become self-correcting systems that do not need to go outside the organization to be corrected.
Okay, thanks for that, Ira. We have so many questions. I know that we're not possibly going to get to them all, so I want to thank everyone for taking the time to ask them. I will share all the questions with Ira after the event, and potentially, Ira, maybe there's a newsletter, email, or other communication you could send in the future to be able to address some of these issues, or perhaps we can point people to resources on your website at the end. So I do have a question from a student from Indiana Wesleyan University. I'm afraid of butchering her name. And she is wondering, she thinks that intelligent disobedience seems to be closely linked with Lutman-Blumen's thoughts on followership in the fact that it is not passive. So what do you think about her thoughts on followers actually being constituents where challenging leadership is actually a part of their roles?
In a forum like this, I don't want to get into, other models of followership and leadership. But I will simply say that, yes, the courageous followership is an active. It is not a passive role. And its whole effort is to discredit the social stereotype of follower as passive, as sheep. It's anything but that. Follower is a full partner in a mission, fully responsible for the outcomes of the mission, for upholding the values, and for supporting the leadership well when the leader is using power beneficially, and for doing whatever they can to correct the leadership if power is being misused.
Thanks. So I have a comment from Bob, who's, I think, the gentleman who got up in the middle of the night in Australia to listen, and really helpful comment. He said that he's found the phrase, "It would be irresponsible of me not to speak up in this instance to be helpful and to be able to push back on authority figures." So I thought that was a helpful phrase. So it would be irresponsible of me not to speak up in this instance.
Well, that's wonderful. And I'm wondering, this may be Bob McGannon, who spends a lot of his time in Australia, and if it is, I just want to mention that he has also done work on intelligent disobedience in the project management field, where sometimes project managers get too much pressure to keep changing the scope of the project, which would ultimately result in project failure. And he does a very good job in taking the concept of intelligent disobedience to be a really first-class project manager.
Fantastic. And yes, it is Bob McGannon, and he's thanking you. So we're about out of time. I know, Ira, that you have some next steps that you want to share with our attendees today.
Well, very good. Yes, just a few actions that you might take, of course, as self-serving as this might be. Please consider reading the book Intelligent Disobedience, which is available in any format you like to read or listen to, and discuss the book. I think, discussing and socializing the book within your workplace, within your family, etc., is what really makes a difference. You can go to my website, irachaleff.com, to get other articles and videos, which you can also use as you see fit. We've already talked about creating practice scenarios, which I strongly encourage. And lastly, I mentioned that we are putting up today a video that is really aimed at parents to help them prepare their children who may need to exercise their own form of intelligent disobedience. And we think and hope that those will be helpful to you. This is a subject that really goes beyond the walls of the office. This talks to each person as a whole person. How do you support beneficial action, and how do you take an effective stance when the actions you're being asked to do or that are being done in the organization's name are not beneficial?
Well, Ira, thank you so much for investing this hour with us and for all the great learning that took place. To all of you who attended today, thank you so much. We will be sending out follow-up, and we appreciate your participation. Have a great day.